Tonight, we are featuring candidates from Minnesota House District 16B. My name is Linda Heine. I am the Voter Service Chair for League of Women Voters in New Ulm. Tonight is our season opener, as it were. We have 4 evenings of candidate forums. We already had our preseason event for the sheriff's primary last August. Hopefully, many of you enjoyed that, found it helpful. The League of Women Voters is a local, state, and national nonpartisan volunteer group. We encourage informed and active participation of citizens in government and influence public policy through education and advocacy. Tonight's event is designed to create the opportunity to educate the voters regarding the candidates here tonight. Membership is open to all, and we would welcome the opportunity to visit with anybody interested in the League of Women Voters. There are members present tonight. We're all wearing buttons or name tags, so please approach us if you would like to discuss potential membership. As I said, this is our season opener. We have 3 other evenings planned. So mark your calendars. October 15th, we'll have the New Ulm City Council and Mayor Candidate Forum. The 22nd of October will be School Board and Brown County Commissioner for District 5. October 24th will be a Brown County Sheriff and Auditor Treasurer. The 15th and 22nd will be here at the New Ulm City Council chambers. The 24th, the event will be at the New Ulm Public Library, which is right across the street. We are partnering tonight with New Ulm Community Access Television, and they are broadcasting tonight. They will be rebroadcasting the forums, so if you are listening to the rebroadcast, please don't call in questions. KNUJ is also broadcasting, and we are very grateful for the support that we get from NewCat, KNUJ, and the Journal, who also covers these events for us. Tonight, I'm going to turn this over to Diane Norland. Diane will be the moderator this evening. Diane is a guest from St. Peter League of Women Voters. One of the candidates for this race has been active with the New Ulm League of Women Voters, and therefore, to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest, we've asked Diane to help us. And so we, and also I want to share that we are careful to make sure that no league members that are active with any candidate's campaign participate in specific planning for our candidate forums. So I will now turn it over to Ms. Norland. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Good evening and welcome. My name is Diane Norland. I'm a moderator trained by the League of Women Voters, and I am from North Mankato. However, if you live around here and you know any Roths or Giesekes, they are my relatives, and good folks too. So we've been doing our genealogy, Nat Geo genogram, very intriguing. I know of no murderers or anything like that in my heritage, which is a good thing. All right, on to the subject tonight. Our candidates tonight will answer questions presented from audience members and the LWV pursuant to a nonpartisan, unbiased, and impartial format established by the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. Our purpose is to create an opportunity for the public to hear the candidates discuss the issues of importance in this election. Our audience tonight includes people present here in the New Ulm City Council chambers. We are also broadcasting live tonight on KNUJ Radio and on New Ulm Community Access Television. Audience members will submit questions in writing to our ushers. Our radio and television audience may call in with their questions. We have 2 numbers. One of the first number is 276-6140. The second number is 276-4711. The League of Women Voters does screen the questions we receive. We may rephrase, combine, or eliminate questions to avoid duplications. Questions will not be asked if they are of a personal nature and not relevant to the office, or if they're designed only to make a statement rather than solicit information. Our intention in screening questions is to select questions that represent the interests of the people who submit the questions. Please contact the candidates directly after the forum for any questions that have not been presented or if you feel that an issue has not been adequately addressed. The two candidates we have here tonight running for Minnesota Legislative Seat 16B are Mindy Kimmel and Paul Torkelson, and they have graciously given me permission to say, "Hey, you." No, not really, kidding. To use Mindy and Paul. We look forward to a respectful learning experience. The candidates are expected to honor time limits. We ask that the audience remain as quiet as you can during the forum to avoid disruption and to facilitate our broadcast. Each candidate will introduce themselves with a short statement with a 1.5 minute time limit. We will start introductions with Mindy Kimmel, and then Paul will be the first to do his closing remarks. Upon completion of the introductions, each candidate will be given 2 minutes to respond to questions which I will read. I will alternate the order of response, so each candidate will answer first on alternative questions. The candidates also each have an opportunity to offer a 1-minute rebuttal to 2 questions of all the questions we ask, if they choose. And candidates will be allowed 2 minutes for a closing statement. So we will begin. There were one more thing. The first 2 questions were drafted by LVW and you and were provided to the candidates in advance. And the questions, yes, they were provided in advance. So we will now start with Mindy and your opening remarks.
First, I would like to thank the League of Women Voters and the moderator, as well as KNUJ, NewCat, and the Journal for disseminating this information. My name is Mindy Kimmel. I was born and raised here in New Ulm. I graduated from the New Ulm High School, and I'm the 6th generation in my family to live in Brown County. My roots run deep here, and I'm invested in what happens. I think it's time for a new, fresh voice, someone with a vision in the legislature. I'm someone with the energy to work together to finish Highway 14, pass affordable health care legislation, solve the current child care shortage, and grow the local economy, which has been impacted by retail closures, lack of rural broadband internet, and a shortage of housing. I have built my campaign around the issues most important to you by having open meetings throughout the district in New Ulm, Redwood Falls, Sleepy Eye, Springfield, Hanska, Wabasso, Morton, Morgan, and Franklin. I've talked with educators and superintendents, farmers and farmers union, healthcare workers and child care providers at meetings and at their doors. I may have knocked your door. The number one issue I've heard is about health care. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree for my work in mental health care. Part of my job, being a family therapist, means I work with individuals, families, and couples to find common ground. I listen to people and I'll listen to you. I know that affordable health care is a big problem and that is unacceptable. I value collaborative leadership and finding common ground so that our government can thoughtfully be of service to the people. Thank you.
Paul?
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Torkelson. I currently serve in the Minnesota House of Representatives. I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for putting this event together. I'd also like to thank the New Ulm City Council for allowing us to use their chambers. I'd like to welcome the listeners to KNUJ Radio, and I see the New Ulm Journal's here too, so I know this is going to be well covered. I'm also here with my wife, Cindy. We've been married for the last 38 years, and I thank her for all her support. I don't think everyone realizes how much a spouse has to sacrifice as we serve. We have 2 adult daughters, and I'd also, of course, like to thank my supporters here in Brown County and across the district. I'm a farmer by trade. I've been farming in Watonwan County for the last 37 years. living and operating the farm where my great-grandfather started farming in 1878. I'm finishing my 5th term in the Minnesota House of Representatives. It's already been 10 years, and I'm running for term number 6. I'm a graduate of St. James High School, Gustavus Adolphus College. Following my college graduation, I had a chance to teach in Fairfax, Minnesota for a few years before I returned to the family farm. In the legislature, I currently am chair of the Transportation Finance Committee. I also serve on Environment and Natural Resources, Ways and Means, Legacy, and the Ethics Committee. I also have served on a number of outside commissions. Issues that I really think this election seems to be focusing on are really similar to what Mindy said. So we'll move on to the questions.
Okay, thank you. And the first question will be, and Paul, you will go first. Most agree that legislators need to work across the aisle with their peers from other political parties. What one issue do you think is most important to work on with legislators across the aisle?
Well, thank you for that question. As I was thinking about this today, it was really hard to pick one issue because there are so many issues that are important to, of course, the entire body at the legislature. But what I started thinking about was how things have changed over the last few years. We've seen that if you look at election results in the state of Minnesota, generally speaking, the rural parts of the state have gone to Republicans, and the more heavily populated areas of the state are going to Democrats in greater numbers. And what happens is then when you get to the legislature and you have a caucus, the Republican caucus doesn't have enough people there from the city, and the Democrat caucus doesn't have enough people there from the country. So I've decided to answer your question that the most important thing we need to do when reaching across the aisle is educate our colleagues that are from other regions of the state so that they understand the issues that are most important to our part of the state, and I have a better understanding of the issues that are important to their part of the state. When you don't have those voices within the caucus, you don't have that conversation going on. So I guess if I try to say it in one issue, it's the issue of better understanding and better education for those parts, the representatives that represent a different demographic part of Minnesota.
Thank you. Mindy?
I work in mental health care, and part of my job is working with couples and families and youth. And I think we all know that working with families and working with youth, there are a lot of conflicts. And so part of my day job is helping people find solutions to their conflicts, helping people to work together. Ultimately, I don't think there's an issue that's worth not working across the aisle, but if I had to pick just one, it would be economic development, knowing that in Minnesota, the economy is different in greater Minnesota than it is in the metro. And the rural decline in retail in particular throughout this district with the empty storefronts is a big problem. I think I'm the one with the energy and the vision and the creativity to work with local governments, to work across the aisle, to fund options that will address the barriers small businesses have to overcome to get started. Our region is ripe for innovation. What we're missing are things like rural broadband, adequate transportation systems, revitalizing our downtowns, and retaining young professionals. Things like rehabilitating old homes, repurposing retail to specialty shops and industries, as well as funding small business startup and variances for historic building renovations, and then also working across the aisle to achieve some tax reform so that local communities can receive taxes from online sales. And I think these are all important economic issues and part of why I think it's so important to work across the aisle.
Thank you. The second question is, what measures would you support to improve and secure elections and voting in Minnesota? And we will start with Mindy.
First of all, I believe that voting is fundamental to our democracy. It's important to increase voter turnout and not decrease it so that everyone has a voice. The Secretary of State didn't find the voter fraud that was alleged after the 2016 election. And I believe that politicians who seek to increase restrictions on voting are not seeing facts and are misleading the public. Minnesota has high voter turnout because we have things like same-day registration and no excuse absentee and early voting. I would take it a step further to allow for automatic voter registration on driver's license and renewal forms, with the renewal box as an option to opt out, so that all people can be automatically registered to vote. I also believe that our elections are secured because we have a paper ballot that's not on the internet. The statewide voter registration system also challenges fraud in that felons and people who are registered in multiple locations are flagged and prevented from voting if they're not eligible. I also think it's important to keep the systems up to date, to support firewalls. And I think that it's really important that we support keeping this equipment up to date to protect the voter, our elections for the future. And funds are available. It's just very important that the legislature accesses those funds that are open for its use. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, Minnesota has a great history of voter participation and election security. We should be proud of that. It goes back many decades, and that's something we should all be proud of and something we should all participate in. The new issue seems to be cybersecurity. There was talk nationally of some potential or attempts to hack voter systems in other states. Our Secretary of State has assured us that there was no hack that happened here in Minnesota. He describes it as there were people looking in the windows, but they were not able to get in the building, and that's good. But we need to strengthen that cybersecurity of our voter system, because the potential is still there, and we see it almost every day in other systems that do get hacked along the way. There was, this past biennium, we did provide $1,858 per precinct to help our local precincts with the equipment they need to conduct a modern election. There is $6.6 million of federal money available that is waiting for us. It should have been approved in this last session, but it was part of the bill that got vetoed. But that money, federal money, is still there, and we should access it and use it to make our election system better. And it is good that we have paper ballots, so that if we do have a problem, we can go back and look through the ballots and do a proper recount. And finally, I think it is appropriate that the Secretary of State continue to audit the same-day registrations and make sure that that the people that register on the same day to vote are, live where they say they live, et cetera, so that we know that they're voting in the right precinct and that they're eligible voters. So that sums it up. But again, we should all be proud of Minnesota's record of good elections.
The third question is, please share your thoughts on the role the legislature should play when it comes to housing programs or housing projects in our part of the state. And Paul, you go first.
Well, thank you. The state has played a part in housing. We do have a Minnesota Housing Finance Agency that gets bond funds and other funds to allocate to building projects all across the state. You probably all have seen some of the older projects that are still out there that we call, in my hometown, we call it a high-rise. I don't know if they use that same term in all towns, but they were built a number of years ago. Many of them have been rehabilitated. Those that haven't should be rehabilitated so that they're good livable spaces for people that need that kind of housing. I do believe government's role should be somewhat limited. I think, if we can possibly meet the housing needs through the private market, that is the preferable way to get housing done. Sometimes there are incentives that can be offered that help to make sure that private investors step forward and can make the investments in communities where housing is needed. But the market should drive the system.
Thank you. Mindy?
So, in my research, I discovered that a full-time minimum wage earner cannot afford a one-bedroom apartment anywhere in Minnesota, not in one county. There's a housing shortage in our district across income levels for seniors, for rentals, for manufactured homes, for places for young professionals to live. Rental vacancies are at 1% or less. A New Ulm task force found the need for up to 500 homes, yet at last check there was only 43 available. I think it's the legislature's role for things like tax credits to flip homes so that someone who decides they want to upgrade their home may be able to get some tax credits if they live there for a number of years. For reducing homelessness through services and supports for those who've been evicted, especially the most vulnerable, like people with mental illness, people who have had criminal histories, because those people are at the biggest disadvantage. And I also would support a dedicated housing fund specifically to help support housing in our region, because I know that without adequate housing, it's preventing professionals from coming to our communities. They're commuting from out of town, and when they can find work closer to home, they take it, and it has economic impact locally.
Thank you. The next question is, this area of the state is having difficulty finding employees to fill many open positions. Are there solutions that can help legislatively or from the state? And that will be Mindy first.
Right now, the unemployment rate is at a very low level. There are jobs available here, but there are a number of problems. First, related to housing. Second, related to transportation. And I think the third part about it really has to do with things like minimum wage and the incentives that are driving people to come here. I can speak for myself as a mental health professional. Part of what allowed me to return to this community after college and graduate school was that I qualified for a loan forgiveness program that allowed me to provide critical mental health services in a high need area. And it was that federal grant that allowed me to do this work and return home. And I think there are things that we can do at the state level to better fund those types of programs so that doctors, mental health professionals, and critical services can receive some support to get good professionals to come out here and prevent our hospitals and clinics from closing.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, thank you. First off, I'd like to say this is a good problem. I've been around when unemployment's been high, and that is a lot worse than low unemployment. And so, but with low unemployment, it does bring forward some other issues and problems. But this really, in a lot of ways, is a good problem. A strong economy is good for all of us. It's good for our state government, and it's good for our communities. Job training, I think, is really critical. I had a chance last week to visit Redwood Falls High School, where they're actually adding facilities to have more hands-on job training, facilities that disappeared over the last number of years. So vocational training at the high school level and vocational training at the community college level is also very, very important. And those training programs need to partner with the businesses that need the workers so that they get the right training on the right equipment so that when they do finish their training program, they can actually step forward into the job force. We're seeing a lot of our hands-on kind of workers have reached retirement age, which has created a lot of openings in the system. So getting these young people not only trained for these jobs, but also getting them to understand that these are great careers. They can make good money, and they can live in a small town and have a great life.
Thank you. The next question is about the opioid crisis. How would you address the opioid crisis in our area as a legislator? Yes. You have my permission. I can check my chart, though.
All right. Well, it is a crisis, one that kind of snuck up on us. It's hard to put a finger on what really caused this problem. I think there's plenty of blame to go around. Our pharmaceutical manufacturers certainly had a role to play. Our healthcare system had a role to play. We've went through a period of time where the success of a hospital setting was based on whether or not everyone in this facility was pain-free. And that really, I think, led to, in some cases, overprescription of pain relievers. And the promise of these opioids was that they wouldn't be addictive. When they first came out, they tried to convince, made the advertisements that these things were not dangerous. Well, we've learned that that's not the case. But it's not just the prescription market. We have a flood of opioids coming in over our borders into the illegal drug market, and we need to try and get a handle on that too. So it's a two-prong, really more than two-prong, but the two big issues are properly prescribing these drugs. There's a need for them in some cases, but I believe they've been overprescribed. And I believe that the medical community is coming around, that they understand that they have to be very cautious with how they utilize these modern drugs. At the same time, we need to try and stop this flow of illegal drugs into the market that causes all sorts of problems within our society.
Thank you. Mindy?
Opioid deaths have been increasing dramatically in Minnesota. Specifically, even in the work that I do, I see the cost that opioid epidemic is having on our communities. I can speak to the fact that equipping law enforcement officers with naloxone or Narcan is an important step. And I have had several of my own clients that would not be alive today if it were not for the first responders, the officers on the scene, having that on them. Second of all, I would support a penny a pill legislation, which would generate $20 million a year to target and treat people with opioid addictions without costing taxpayers. The third thing I would do is support programs like the Yellow Line Project that exists in Mankato and in other communities. This is a program where people in mental health or chemical dependency crises, instead of being sent to jail, they can be triaged to get the services, the treatment, the support that they need. The revenue generated by not having these people go to jail and be incarcerated there leads many of these programs to be self-sustaining after initial startup costs. Plus the option to bill for insurance through the triaging process and getting people into services, which will put much of a less burden on our legal system locally. And so those would be the programs that I would support in combating the opioid epidemic.
Thank you. The next question is about Highway 14. What could be done to accelerate extending Highway 14 all the way to New Ulm? And we will start with Mindy.
Thank you. In the 1960s, it was estimated that Highway 14 would be a 4-lane by the year of 2000, and the cost for this highway is increasing every year that we wait. Highway 14 is one of the most dangerous roads in the state, and it's also the most populated corridor without a current 4-lane. It continues to be unfunded and unscheduled on our side of Nicollet. I want you to get home safe. I want to get to work and home safe. The cost of gas has been decreasing because our cars are more fuel efficient, we get better gas mileage, and that's why I would support taking another look at what we could do to fund this via a carefully thought out gas tax, only if those funds would be dedicated for transportation costs. This would allow tourists who use the roads to support the cost of their upkeep. Highway 14, having a 4-lane, would give the ability to pass, it would improve safety, and with over 2,000 semi-trucks headquartered in New Ulm, as well as farm equipment and 6,000 daily commuters to New Ulm, it's really important that we look at this issue. I think Highway 14 has been a big failure in our legislature in the past several years because this has been a problem since before I could drive. My opponent is the chair of the Transportation Finance Committee, and I think that the change in the rules has not been helpful in our area. He authored the legislation that changed the rules to traffic counts instead, which has shortchanged our area. And there were several community members and legislators that spoke out about this before this bill was passed. It's important that we take another look at those rules and update them so that we can target transportation funds more closely in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, thank you. Highway 14, of course, has been a major issue in this region for a long, long time. But over my 10 years in the legislature, we've made good progress. We've gone from Mankato to Nicollet, and we all know about the project that's going on right outside of New Ulm here today. And this last year, we had historic amount of transportation funding for the state, the most we've had in a long time. And we funded a major portion of Highway 14, the section from Owatonna to Dodge Center. It's a big project. It will complete the 4-lane between Rochester and Nicollet. And the next step, of course, is to continue to advocate for this section that comes to New Ulm. It's been on my radar the whole entire time, but they don't let me just write out the checks to fund highway projects. That's not the way it works. We did pass legislation that identified a priority system, and projects all across the state apply to the DOT, and the DOT rated those projects as far as their importance. So you get a priority list with the most important projects at the top, and you work your way down. So when we got Corridors of Commerce funding this year, we knocked off some major projects off the top of that list. That means that the section of Highway 14 from Nicollet to New Ulm raises up higher on that priority list and has a better chance of being funded in the next go-round. So I wish Highway 14 were the only project in the state that needed to be funded, but that's not the case. There are highways in virtually every district that are just as important to their constituents as Highway 14 are to my constituents. So it's a big deal. I work hard on it, but there's a limit to how much can be accomplished in any given year.
Thank you. Mindy, rebuttal?
I would like to add that the Department of Transportation used the criteria that was enacted in legislation just a few years ago, which my opponent authored. They were following the rules that were given to them, and that led to the Greater Minnesota money was still given within 40 miles of U.S. Bank Stadium. That the regional balance identified was not successful because all of the money for transportation funding was centralized into the metro area or within 40 miles of there.
Thank you. Paul, rebuttal?
Well, good old Highway 14. It's a never-ending topic. Mindy's right. The first allocation of Corridors of Commerce money did end up focused near the metro area. And it wasn't my fault. It was DOT. They decided, the legislation did require regional balance. And if you saw a map of where that money was allocated, it was this blue spot right around the Northwest Metro. They decided, unbeknownst to me, they decided to use the Metropolitan Maintenance District to identify the entire metropolitan area. That's only about 7 counties. Well, we all know the metropolitan area is much bigger than that, but then they used just anything outside of that border to be for what they would call Greater Minnesota projects. I was livid. I was very upset. But then in the process of negotiations, we did get those outstate projects in Greater Minnesota, Highway 23 between Wilmer and St. Cloud, and Highway 14 from Owatonna to Dodge Center.
Thank you. And I've been asked to announce again the 2 phone numbers for call-ins. Again, the first number is 276-6140, and the second number is 276-4711. The next question. This past Sunday, the United Nations received a climate change report from an intergovernmental panel of Nobel Prize-winning members. The report details drastic effects on humans and our environment if warming of the planet continues. The report states that drastic action on the part of national leaders will be required to reduce human-caused warming and mitigate the impact. Though resolution of climate change may require national action, do you feel we as Minnesotans, or you as a potential Minnesota state legislator, can play any role to address climate change, and if so, what is that role? And we will start with Paul.
Well, thank you. The evidence for climate change is mounting. I agree. But to try and decide whether you're a believer or a non-believer, to me, is not the issue. The issue is, what are the practical things we can do today that are sensible and actually bend the curve in the right direction as we try to reduce human impact on our climate. I'm not absolutely convinced it's happening, but I do believe it. When I look at the weather right now, I wonder, as a farmer, what is if things aren't changing. So our role at the state of Minnesota is somewhat limited, although Minnesota has been a leader in many of these areas through biofuels, through alternative energy. Our energy goals have been very aggressive, much more aggressive than most other states, and they continue to be enforced. So we're moving a lot of things in the right direction. I'm certainly willing to consider other options that are sensible things to do that to reduce greenhouse gases. I think that is appropriate. But we have to be careful that we don't overreact, because we can't fix this problem just here in Minnesota. This is a worldwide problem, and negotiations on a broader basis are what are really going to make the difference in the long run. We should do what we can here in Minnesota. I'm not opposed to that, but it should be reasonable steps and not unreasonable.
Thank you. Mindy?
I think one of the biggest ways that we can combat climate change is by looking at how energy is generated. Things like wind and solar, and making that economical and providing incentives for communities, for individuals who are willing to convert to more sustainable sources of energy. I specifically think of even New Ulm. Within the last year or so, got its first electric car charging station, that there are things we can do in our community, and there are things that we can do statewide to support those initiatives. I also support biofuel, reducing the dependence on foreign oil and things like that. But I think it's really important to look across industries, to look at community members and businesses, and what can we do as a state to provide incentives for renewable sources of energy specifically.
Thank you. The next question is about mental health. What role can the state play in making mental health care accessible to those in need of it? And we will start with Mindy.
Thank you for that question. So I work in mental health care, and my experience is that there is a huge shortage of mental health care, which I've somewhat talked about already. Our region is identified in the federal system as a critical need area because of the population, because of the distance people have to travel to get to a provider, and a shortage of providers. And so that qualifies much of our region to be able to get things like loan forgiveness programs for mental health therapists who want to work here if you work for an approved placement. However, the funding for that is likely to be significantly cut, if not eliminated, within the next year or two. And that's a big concern, because that is what allowed me to come back to this community, to return home to New Ulm, where I grew up, and continue to provide mental health services. I think it's very important that we as a state look at the mental health needs in our region and statewide to look at how can we fill those gaps in care. I think we all know someone who has experienced a mental health difficulty. I see them every day. Things like I mentioned earlier, like the Yellow Line Project, which can divert people from the jails and into treatment. But ultimately, we need to find ways to increase providers and get people trained so that they can provide adequate mental health services out in our area. And part of that is keeping the clinics and the hospitals open to serve them locally and not having to drive hours for an appointment.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, thank you. Certainly mental health seems to be rising in recognition and importance. We know that many of the prisoners in our prisons are actually have mental health issues, and we've in the past not been very good at addressing those. I think we're getting better at it. We need to continue to make progress so we understand better what is affecting people's behavior. Also, I think our police forces have been getting better training so that they don't overreact in a situation where the person that they're confronting actually has a mental health issue. They look like a lawbreaker, and they may be a lawbreaker, but what's behind it? And for our enforcement officers to be able to do a better job of recognizing when a person is having a mental health crisis and respond appropriately in those situations to avoid the potential of injury and mistreatment. Within our education system, of course, we have the need for mental health counselors and school psychiatrists, and again, it's a situation where we have probably a harder time filling those jobs out here in greater Minnesota because it's harder for us to attract the professionals. So we need to continue to look at programs that can actually bring the right people into the right place and get the job done.
Thank you. The next question is about senior care workers. A forum was recently held at Oak Hills Living Center, where the need for addressing the growing aging population and the dwindling supply of geriatric workers, much of it due to the inequitable pay scale for health workers in this field and others that address care of the vulnerable. A few years ago, the legislature did meet a request that shifted the mandated formula sufficiently where an increase, which some would deem inadequate even at the time, was enabled. Did that tweak go far enough, or do you have other suggestions to address these daycare providers earning at least what they would at a fast food restaurant? And we will start with you, Paul.
Well, thank you. These jobs are very important. They're very important to our society. They're very important to our elderly population. I've spent a lot of time in nursing homes over the years with my mother and both of my wife's parents, having spent time in the nursing home. I know how hard the work is. I know how dedicated the workers are to their jobs. We did, as you mentioned, have an increase in funding a couple of years ago. That helped. I don't believe it's enough. We are in, as we've talked earlier this evening, in the situation where we're virtually at full employment. That makes it that much more challenging to fill these jobs. And it's not just the nursing home folks. We also have a whole other set of workers that work at our group homes. They are actually currently probably at a disadvantage even to the nursing home workers. There was a 7% cut that needs to be fixed. It was just a mistake within the law, really, that should have been fixed last year, and we will. I promote fixing that and bringing those folks that work at these facilities into a better position where they can make more money. And it's an ongoing problem. Same time, we've done everything we can to help elderly folks stay in their homes, but that requires, in many cases, somebody to be able to come into the home to help them, and finding those workers will continue to be a challenge. We want to take good care of our elderly. It's very important, and I support making sure that our elder care is handled properly.
Thank you. Mindy?
There is a big problem with care for our seniors in our communities. Specifically, going back to the question, there aren't enough workers. The pay is not great, and there are things that we can do at the state level for that. First of all, by looking at that moratorium that's preventing a lot of senior care facilities from expanding, so that these businesses that want to expand can, in hopes that that will allow them to pay their staff more equitably. But I would go even further and say we ultimately need to increase the minimum wage in Minnesota so that people can get paid a livable wage for their full-time work. I also would support better care for in-home senior staff, such that even those rates are unreasonably low for the level of care that seniors need to stay in their homes. People who want to stay in their homes should be able to, but there's such a shortage of workers that many of them are forced into senior living facilities before they would like to because they cannot get regular, stable care. The other piece that I would look at is related to offering trades in public high schools, because I think home care, senior care, child care are programs that we can better prepare our youth for people who are interested in going into those fields of study.
Thank you. The next question is about campaign finance, and we will begin with Mindy. What changes in campaign finance law do you support, especially regarding openness and transparency of donations?
One of the things that I learned in running my campaign this year is how important campaign finance laws are, specifically in Minnesota. We ultimately have some of the better laws across the nation. I do careful due diligence with how I spend my campaign money. My concern is that with things like Citizens United, it allows politicians to be bought by corporations, and that is a big problem because our elected officials should represent us and not the interests of other areas, people out of state, people across the nation, over the people who live here, the people who their laws are impacting. I have concerns that corporations are funneling money against public interests. And even though I think Minnesota has some pretty good campaign finance laws, at least for those of us running at the state level, I would work to overturn Citizens United so that ultimately everyone across the nation can know that their donation counts and that they will be represented by their elected official and that they will not be getting secret money from elsewhere, as well as having transparent campaign finance reporting like we do in Minnesota.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, we have a good campaign finance regulatory body here in Minnesota. They do keep a great track of us and careful eyes on us all the time. We report everything that we do, and we report it within the limits of the law. We're fortunate in that in a race like ours that there's really no dark money or big corporate money that has any direct influence on our elections, as far as I know anyway. How that will proceed in the future, I don't know. It's really a federal issue. I did have a chance to look a little bit at campaign spending in the last few cycles, and on statewide races for the governor and for U.S. Senate seats, the Democrats have spent twice as much money as Republicans in virtually every one of those. They seem to have a lot more resources available. I'm not sure exactly why, but it's just a fact. So anyway, campaign finance in our election, I think everything is on the up and up, and there's nothing untoward going on that I know of, and I'm happy to have good support, and I thank my supporters that have donated to my campaign.
Thank you, Paul. And it may be true that this is the last question, unless somebody else brings another one. So, and we will start, Paul, with you. This question is about clean water. Clean water is crucial to Minnesota. Now that the buffer law has been implemented, what should be the state's next step to improve and safeguard water quality? And Paul, it's you.
Well, thank you. I am very active in the issues of water quality. It's for Minnesota. We should be proud that we have good laws and a good system, and we are blessed with a great amount of natural water resources here in Minnesota. We're at the headwaters of at least 3 major watersheds. We border the Great Lake Superior, which is one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And in general, we've done a pretty good job, but there's always issues that come up and that we need to work on in the issue of water and water safety. One of our big challenges right now is the issue of infrastructure. Our small towns especially, and really all our towns, have got issues with the things that you don't see, the things that are underground in our cities. Whether it's your sewer lines or your drinking water lines, this infrastructure is aging and in many cases has started to fail. Replacing it is very expensive. We invested extra money in the last 2 bienniums, really, to help small towns and really all cities keep this very critical infrastructure in good shape. Having clean, safe drinking water and making sure that our wastewater is properly treated before it's discharged in the environment is one of those basic things that has to be done well. We do it pretty well, but this aging infrastructure is a very big issue, one that we'll continue to need to invest resources in to make sure that these systems do what they're supposed to do. Beyond that, as a farmer, of course, water is critical to my business. Right now, I got a little too much, but and it sounds like there's more coming. But overall, the nexus between agriculture and water quality is a challenging one. You mentioned the buffer situation. You know, the most interesting thing about that entire buffer conversation was that we found out that 80% of the buffers were in place before the law was ever passed.
Thank you. Mindy?
Could you repeat the question?
Certainly. Clean water is crucial to Minnesota. Now that the buffer law has been implemented, what should be the state's next step to improve and safeguard water quality?
I think the first thing is to make sure that we're maintaining the pristine nature of our clean water sources currently. Things like the boundary waters and parts of our state that have some of the cleanest water in the nation. It's very important that we maintain all conservation efforts to keep them that way. I also think same as Paul discussed, the infrastructure system related to water treatment is an area of concern that I've heard from people at my meetings across the district, that there are services in need of funding for repairs and for ongoing maintenance. Another issue I've heard concerning people who work in that industry is the different rules year to year of what level is acceptable and what level is not. And I think it's important that we be straightforward and clear about what levels does the science say are appropriate levels for our water to be at, and enact the procedures necessary to rectify it if they're outside of those levels. That requires some transparency of local government as well as with community members to rectify those situations when the water needs to be better maintained. I also support ways to support conservation efforts so that farmers can have incentives for maintaining different practices, for ways to ensure that what they're doing meets the best standard of practice, and some financial support for trying new things, for being willing to do some research, try some new methods, and see if it makes a difference. I think related to the buffers specifically, I think it's also important that we bring people to the table to look at how can we improve that as well, such as compensating farmers for their lost revenue related to the land that they've lost related to the buffers.
Thank you. I spoke too soon. One more question. Me and my big mouth. Addressing climate change may be one of the areas in which all parties could work together. How do you see the various factions of the legislature working together on this issue? And we will start with Mindy.
I think when it comes to climate change, it's important that we read the science and that we look at what science tells us is happening. Because ultimately, the risk is too high that if we wait until it's too late, we won't be able to turn it around. And so it's very important that all of the factions of government work together, that the Department of Agriculture has a voice in this, that the governor has a voice in this, that the communities have a voice in this, so that we can all talk about how we can all work together to find common ground so that we all know where our stake in this is. Because there are things that we can all do together that can move this forward. And that's what I believe. And so going back to what I said earlier related to clean energy sources is important. Supporting newer models of electronics that will support greener energy is important. That there are things we can all do daily to move this forward.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you. Well, we've talked about this issue quite a bit already. One thing that I like to say in relation to climate change, but in relation to environmental issues in general, is that it's hard to be green when you're in the red. If we don't have a vibrant economy, we won't be able to afford to do the things that we need to do. So we have to be careful as we move forward in this area that we don't disturb the economy. If we move too stridently and cause the economy to collapse, we won't be able to afford to do the things we want to do in order to maintain the environment. So as a farmer, I know that's true, that if when money's tight, it's a lot harder to address issues like environmental issues that we do need to address.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we did get one more, and I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and ask it, but give them 1 minute instead of 2 minutes, and then we need to wrap up.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Okay, all right, and Mindy, you will go first. Paul, you will go first, whatever. Okay, whatever you say. My chart ran out of space with all the questions, which is nice, but it's a problem. Okay. What will you do to ensure all children in Minnesota more access to high-quality daycare and preschool care?
The daycare issue has been a dramatic one in the last few years. We've seen a huge migration of daycare providers out of the business, and I believe part of that is due to overregulation. We've made it just too difficult for these daycare providers to actually maintain their facilities in a way that meets all of the requirements. So we've seen a very large decrease in the number of especially in-home daycare providers that have been able to provide this care. Folks that need daycare, that's one of the first questions they ask when considering a community. I'll mention the facility in Franklin. It's a community-based daycare that's been established by a combination of the city, the county, and other community resources. I've been able to tour it a couple of times. It seems to be working very well. It's a good model for a small town. Small towns need to have daycare available, and bringing community resources together to provide it, I think, is a very good way to go about the work.
Okay, thank you. Mindy?
The number one issue I heard talking with childcare providers about what is impacting their business is the cost of health insurance. That unless someone is on a plan with their spouse or someone else, they cannot afford the rising costs of health care with owning their own in-home childcare business. There's also a 1-year waiting list for child care in our area. And so unless you know you're pregnant 3 months before, you are going to have trouble finding a spot for your infant. Startup costs, licensing fees, getting your house to code, inspections that take weeks, and not enough local continuing education classes, despite the continuing ed hours doubling in the last 6 years, are all issues impacting local child care providers. I want to partner with employers to provide on-site child care, raise the county rates, or look at adjusting the quota by 1 year, so that children can be better served, as well as letting unlicensed providers the option to serve up to 2 families.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I think we're good. All right, we will have closing remarks, 2 minutes, and we start with Paul.
Well, thank you, Diane, and thank you for venturing over into Brown County to host this event.
Oh, it's like home.
We're glad you're here to visit all your relatives, so that's wonderful. And also, of course, thanks to the League of Women Voters that sponsored this event and have put this together. They've done a great job over the years making sure that candidates get in front of our constituents, and I appreciate that. Thanks to the city again, and to KNUJ Radio and the newspaper all for covering and supplying what we need for this event. And thanks to my opponent for being here. It's been a pleasure to get to know her and some of her ideas, and we've had a lot to talk about. 3 issues that, again, that are critical here in this election. Healthcare, I think, continues to be a major issue. Of affordable care with a reasonable deductible is something that should be available. We've actually seen an announcement recently where premiums are actually going down for those that purchase their health care in the private market. That's great news, but it's a small step in the right direction. We need to continue to work on that issue. Taxes, we need to pass a tax bill as soon as possible to conform with the federal tax laws that have caused a number of changes within the tax system, and Minnesota state tax law needs to catch up to those changes through a conformity bill and hopefully some more tax relief. And finally, the last issue would be transportation. I pledge to continue my work in transportation. I've gotten a lot of awards over this last couple of years. It's been my first chance to serve on and chair the Transportation Committee. I'm a pro-life candidate. I support the Second Amendment. I believe in a strong business climate, and I am an advocate for agriculture. These are all important issues to me, and I ask for your vote in the November election.
Thank you. Mindy.
My name is Minnie Kimmel, and I'm born and raised here in New Ulm. I'm invested in what happens here, and I've talked with many of you already about the issues most important to you as I've built my campaign. We've talked about mental health and opioids. We've talked about childcare and transportation. But there's a few issues that we haven't gotten a chance to talk about that I want to highlight quickly. Specifically related to affordable health care, that I think it's important to offer immediate relief with a Minnesota Care buy-in that would come at no cost to taxpayers. Second, expanding rural broadband in our community so that our entire region can be connected to the internet at high speeds. And third of all, I think it's important to fully fund public education, especially during years of a budget surplus. I want to listen to your concerns to find common ground solutions to the problems that you are facing. Are you happy with how things have been going for the last 10 years, or is it time to try something new? To try a leader who values collaboration, being a voice for the people here, finding common ground, someone with the energy and creativity to get things done. I'm Minnie Kimmel, and I want to represent you, but first I need your vote on November 6th. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes our forum this evening. The League of Women Voters of New Ulm thank you all for your participation here. We thank the candidates for sharing their views and their willingness to run for office. Thanks also goes to our question screeners and timers, to the NewCat crew, to KNUJ and the Journal. If you need to register to vote or need more information on elections, talk to one of our members here tonight. In addition, you can find comprehensive information about elections in Minnesota at www.minvotes.org. Early voting has already started. Election Day is November 6th. Be sure to vote. Thank you and good night.